Introduction. On September the 11th, 2001, there were a series of suicide attacks by Al-Qaeda upon the United States. 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked and intentionally crashed 4 commercial passenger planes. They crashed the first 2 into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. The third plane crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington. And finally, the fourth plane crashed into a field near Shanksville after the passengers managed to overthrow the hijackers and crash the plane into a field instead of another building. The total death toll for the September 11th attacks was 2,993 people, this including the 19 hijackers. The domestic response. The initial shock on the Americans from the attacks was huge. They had to completely rethink their relationships with the rest of the world. George Bush made a speech on September the 20th explaining everything that had happened. He talked about the 9 days of rescue and all the recovery efforts made by the police and firefighters. He then said what he intended to do about all of this. George Bush set up the Coalition of the 9/11. This provided financial assistance to survivors and families of victims. By 2003, there were 2,833 applicants. Next, the Congress set up the USA Patriot Act, which stated that it would help detect and prosecute terrorism and any other crimes. This had its bad sides, though, as people went against this, saying that it wouldn't help anything because they would never be able to catch a terrorist. They hadn't caught many before, and so they weren't likely to catch any now. Then in 2002, President Bush signed the Homeland Security Act, which represented the largest restructuring of the US government in contemporary history. International response. The international response to the United States was really positive. Many nations around the globe offered pro-American support, which helped a lot. Tens of thousands of people attempted to flee Afghanistan, fearing their own safety. They fled into Pakistan, who then closed off its border with Afghanistan due to the fact that they had already had many refugees from previous terrorist attacks where people had fled the country. The United States led a coalition of international forces against the removal of the Taliban for harboring the Al-Qaeda organization, which Osama bin Laden was the leader of. America arrested over 600 supposed Al-Qaeda members and put them into a detention center they set up in Guantanamo Bay. Here they held what they called illegal enemy suspects. How airport security has changed. As a consequence of these attacks, there have been many drastic changes to airport security. For months after the attacks, there were armed security guards all around airports. On September the 11th, many of the hijackers managed to board the aircraft carrying knives, as this was acceptable at the time. So now passengers cannot carry liquids, gels, aerosols, or any sharp objects. All bottles must be put in separate plastic bags for separate screening. Security on aircraft has now drastically changed. Cockpit doors are now bulletproof, and most aircraft has CCTV for pilots to monitor their passengers. Pilots also have the option to carry a gun, but they must be trained to use it. Hijackers on September 11th managed to get on the plane without valid ID. So this is why today you must have proper ID or you are not allowed to even go through the security checkings. Then they introduced the TSA, which is the Transport Security Association. This basically controls all the security things in the airport and is now running every US airport. In my opinion, Al-Qaeda succeeded in terrorizing the world because after this, airline companies went bust simply because people were frightened to fly. Security is now a priority but has drastically affected air travel. The fight against terrorism is the foremost problem faced by probably every government in the world. We will never forget September the 11th, 2001.